In the sweltering midday heat at a construction site near a school in New Orleans, a quiet black laborer, long overlooked because of his past, was eating lunch when he saw a young boy climbing a rusted scaffold seconds from falling onto the concrete below. Without hesitation, the worker risked his life to save him. What he didn't know was that the boy's mother was the school principal, the very person who would later offer him a life-changing opportunity and the recognition he'd never known. It was just past noon in New Orleans, the kind of sticky southern heat that made everything feel slower. The construction site stood across the street from a modest elementary school, where the final bell for the morning classes had just rung. Kids fluttered out onto the schoolyard, their laughter floating into the humid air. The buzz of cicadas, the distant honk of a streetcar, and the clatter of tools on steel scaffoldings filled the background. A few construction workers lounged in the shade of a half-built concrete wall, sharing jokes in bursts of Spanish and thick southern drawls. The scent of sweat, rust, and cafeteria food mixed in the air. On the edge of the crew sat Darnell Brooks, a black man in his mid-30s with deep-set eyes, a short beard peppered with flecks of gray, and a build sculpted from years of hauling cinder blocks and steel rods. His neon vest hung loose over a sweat-drenched white t-shirt, and he wore his hard hat tilted back, shading his face just enough to see the sandwich in his hands. He didn't talk much, didn't join in the jokes. He ate slow, eyes scanning the street like someone who didn't fully trust the world to leave him alone. And maybe with good reason. "Yo, D, you eatin' by yourself again?" One of the younger workers called out, not unkindly, but with that edge of mocking that always lingered in their voices. Another snorted. "You know he don't like mixing mayo and mustard, says it's a dignity thing." Darnell didn't look up. He was used to it. Used to being tolerated on site but never welcomed. He was the only black man on the crew, and though no one ever used the slurs out loud, the message had always been clear. They called him old school not out of respect, but because he wasn't one of them, not fast-talking, not backslapping. Just efficient, quiet, black. He'd heard them whispering before. About how he got the job because of diversity targets. How he probably had a record, he did, but none of their business. How he never smiles, how he acts like he's better than the rest. They didn't know about his daughter. They didn't ask. They didn't know about the nights he spent wiping grease off his hands so he could help her with her homework, or about the way he'd once slept in his car for 3 weeks between jobs. They didn't ask. So Darnell kept to himself, kept things clean, kept his pride. That day his lunch was peanut butter and jelly, not because he liked it, but because it was cheap and quick. He unwrapped the sandwich carefully, like a ritual. Across the street, he noticed the kids playing. One in particular caught his eye. Luis, a wiry little boy with unruly black curls and scraped knees. Luis often wandered too close to the fence that separated the school from the construction zone, fascinated by the big machines and the clanking tools. Today was no different. The boy stood on tiptoes, fingers laced through the chain link, peering in like he was watching a movie. Darnell cracked a small smile, just a flicker. The kid reminded him of someone. But then, a sharp metallic clack, a sound out of place, not from the tools, something looser. Wrong. And Darnell's eyes narrowed. He didn't know it yet, but lunch was over. And something was about to snap. Darnell squinted toward the sound, barely lifting his head as he chewed, trying to place it. Something metallic giving way, a tremor in the bones of the site. He instinctively looked up toward the north scaffold. No one was supposed to be on that side right now. It had rained hard the night before, and they hadn't secured all the planks yet. They were waiting on the foreman to approve replacement. Rust had eaten through some of the joints over the years, typical of tight-budget contracts in neighborhoods like this, so parts of the upper platforms were basically hazards with a smile. At first, he didn't see anything. But then, in that strange silence between a breeze and a heartbeat, he caught it. Movement. Small, jerky. A pair of sneakers, scuffed white and too small to belong to any of the crew, climbing where they absolutely shouldn't be. Luis. The boy had somehow found a loose panel near the fence and slipped into the site. Probably had done it before. Maybe he thought it was a game. Maybe he wanted to see the world from above, the way kids do without thinking that gravity doesn't forgive. He was already halfway up the lowest scaffold, one hand gripping a side rail, the other balancing a half-eaten granola bar. His small face was set in concentration, lip bitten, knees wobbling with effort. Darnell's body tensed. No one else had seen it yet. The other workers were still joking, some lighting cigarettes behind the tool trailer. The buzz of the sight had returned. Only Darnell had gone still. He set his sandwich down, not rushed, not slow, like something in him knew what was coming, and then it happened. Luis took one more step onto the next plank, rotted, waterlogged from the storm. The sound it made was soft, almost shy. A crack followed by a shudder. The beam didn't break entirely. It shifted just enough to throw the boy off balance. Luis yelped and dropped the granola bar. His arms flailed for a second, then both hands latched desperately onto a side rail as the plank beneath him slid out and dropped to the ground with a dull thud. A cloud of dust rose where it landed. Now the others noticed. A shout rang out, someone cursing. Another dropped his wrench. One guy ran toward the office trailer, yelling for the foreman, but no one moved toward the scaffold. Luis was dangling, his feet kicking open air, maybe 15 feet off the ground. Not deadly for an adult, maybe, but for a child that size? A direct drop to concrete would snap bones at best. End a life at worst. The scaffold groaned again, its integrity compromised, the joints wobbling under the unbalanced weight. The piece Luis clung to wasn't meant to support that kind of strain. It was a sidebar, bolted from both ends, never tested like this. Darnell was already moving, not running, not shouting, just moving with the urgency of someone who'd seen the world go sideways before and knew hesitation only fed regret. He threw down his hard hat, kicked off his gloves, and headed straight for the ladder without a word. The foreman was yelling behind him. Something about liability, wait for EMS, don't touch the kid. But Darnell wasn't hearing it. Not because he didn't care, but because there were only seconds left. You could see it in the way the bar bent, the way Luis's fingers twitched and slipped, the way his mouth was open but no sound came out, just silent, sheer panic. The ladder was old and unsteady, bolted directly into the side wall of the structure. Darnell's boots hit each rung with a certainty that belied the fear racing in his chest. He didn't look down, didn't look at the others, just at the boy, at that small body swinging like a loose hinge. He could see the terror in Luis's eyes now. The boy was crying, not loudly, just leaking fear out of every pore. "I got you," Darnell said quietly, not shouting, not dramatic, just firm. "Don't let go." The scaffold trembled again. The wind picked up, carrying the sour scent of rain-soaked wood and diesel fuel. The whole site seemed to inhale. Darnell was up now, just a few feet from the boy, but he had to move across a thin platform that had warped in the rain. It bowed under his weight. One misstep and he'd fall too. He tested the beam with one foot. It held, but barely. The metal groaned. He kept going, hands out, body low, not rushing. The world shrank to 1 square yard. Boy, man, air. Luis's fingers slipped an inch. He whimpered. Darnell lunged, not recklessly, but with precision, like he'd done this kind of thing in another life. His left hand grabbed the bar for balance, and his right caught the boy by the shirt collar first, then under both arms, hoisting him up in one swift, brutal movement. Luis clung to him now, wrapping arms around Darnell's neck, face buried in his chest. Darnell held tight, adjusting his grip to cradle the boy against his side. A gust of wind rattled the frame again, and the bar that had held Luis gave way completely, snapping with a sickening metal shriek and falling to the ground below. Someone screamed, but both of them were still up there, Darnell now bearing all the weight. He took one breath, just one, then began a slow, careful climb down back the way he came, every step deliberate, every movement measured. When they finally touched the concrete, the crowd that had gathered outside the gate, teachers, students, neighbors, crew members, broke into scattered applause. Some clapped from relief, others just because they didn't know what else to do. One of the men who'd mocked Darnell earlier muttered Jesus under his breath. Another one whispered, "I thought that dude was just weird." The boy's mother, who had rushed out from the school office, was now clutching Louis, crying into his shoulder. Louis wouldn't let go of Darnell at first. He just kept whispering, thank you, over and over. And Darnell, he didn't say a word, didn't puff his chest or look for a camera. He just took a step back, picked up his sandwich off the ground, and walked back toward the half wall where he'd been sitting before the world tipped sideways. No one noticed the blood on his palm where the rusted bar had cut him, or the way his chest rose and fell just a little faster than usual. They saw the rescue. They didn't see the cost, not yet. But in that moment, for the first time all day, they looked at Darnell differently. Not as a quiet black man who kept to himself, not as the guy who didn't joke around, but as something else entirely. And the scaffold, now cracked and empty, swayed in the breeze behind them like a ghost of what could have been. The air still hadn't settled. Dust floated lazily in the sunbeams that pierced through the scaffold gaps. The foreman stood frozen, his walkie-talkie still buzzing from a dispatcher repeating, "Is the child secure? Is anyone injured?" Someone else had already called 911, but the urgency had passed, replaced by the strange silence that follows a near tragedy. For a long moment, all anyone could do was watch Darnell, standing with his chest rising and falling, his hands red and raw, and a quiet tension in his jaw. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His eyes said it all. Louis had been seconds away from slipping, and the boy knew it. Everyone did. The other workers began to shuffle awkwardly. Some glanced around, as if trying to pretend they'd been halfway to reacting too. But they weren't. They had shouted, pointed, frozen. One guy even fumbled his phone to record. Not Darnell. He hadn't hesitated. No pep talk, no meeting, no plan. Just action. Real action. And that truth hung over them, a quiet indictment in the shape of a man with rust on his sleeves and sweat soaking through his back. The scaffold still swayed behind them, that same broken piece lying on the concrete nearby, bent like a warning sign no one had read. Louise's mother was still crouched beside her son, running her hands through his curls, wiping the dirt from his cheeks, whispering something in Spanish that cracked with emotion. Louise kept glancing over at Darnell, like he didn't want him to disappear, like the man who had reached into the sky to pull him back down might vanish the moment no one was looking. But Darnell wasn't going anywhere. He sat down on the curb near the gate, slow and careful now, knees stiff from the adrenaline drop, hand gripping a folded rag someone had tossed him to cover the cut on his palm. He didn't even flinch as he applied pressure. He just looked out toward the street like the world was slowly rebooting around him. The paramedics arrived minutes later. They knelt beside Louis, checked his vitals, asked him his name and if he felt dizzy. He shook his head. He kept saying he was okay, but he wouldn't let go of Darnell's vest. One medic looked over, eyebrow raised. "You family?" Darnell shook his head once. "Construction crew," he said flatly. The medic nodded but gave him a second glance, the kind that says you did something you weren't supposed to, but damn if it didn't save a life. They checked Darnell too, offered him a ride to the ER for the hand. He declined. Said he'd clean it himself, said it wasn't deep, it was, but he didn't care. The foreman finally approached him, looking somewhere between rattled and embarrassed. He crouched awkwardly, his clipboard hanging at his side. "You know, protocol says—" He started, then trailed off when Darnell looked at him, not angry, just tired. The foreman cleared his throat. "We'll, figure out the paperwork later. You did good, Brooks." Darnell gave a short nod, that was all. No grin, no fist bump, just a man who had done what needed doing. But beneath the surface, something had cracked open. The other workers, who used to snicker when Darnell walked by with his thermos and silent dignity, were now watching him like they didn't quite recognize who he was. Not a ghost anymore, not a quota higher, a man who had moved when they froze. One guy, Rico, the youngest on the team, muttered under his breath to another, "Would have dropped like a damn rock if he hadn't grabbed him." The other guy just nodded slowly, eyes never leaving Darnell. He looked down at his own hands, still clean. After the medics cleared Louis to head home for rest, the boy broke away from his mother for one last word. He walked up to Darnell with nervous steps, dirt still on his pants and knuckles scabbed from gripping metal too tight. He looked up, eyes shining. "Were you scared?" he asked. Darnell studied the boy for a second, then said, "Yeah. But I didn't let it stop me." Luis blinked, trying to make sense of that answer. Darnell added, "It's okay to be scared. Just don't freeze." Luis nodded like he'd heard something sacred. Then he did something no one expected. He hugged him, arms wrapped tight around a man most adults barely spoke to. Darnell hesitated only a second before resting one hand gently on the kid's back. After they left, the sight felt different. The workday technically wasn't over, but no one wanted to pick up tools. A few guys drifted to corners to call their wives, tell them what happened, talk about this crazy thing at the job, but Darnell didn't speak to anyone. He stood up, dusted off his pants, and walked to the edge of the job site, where his lunch still lay half-wrapped under a loose napkin. He sat down again, unwrapped it slowly, and took a bite like he'd never left, like this was just another day. But it wasn't. People were watching him now, not with amusement or annoyance, but with something deeper. They didn't say it out loud, but they knew. That man had climbed into danger for a kid that wasn't his. No questions asked, no glory wanted. They would talk about it for weeks. Some would exaggerate, say the whole scaffold collapsed, say Darnell caught the boy in mid-air, but those who were there knew the real version was better than the myths, because it was raw and real, and it was done by a man no one had ever given a second look. They had seen his skin, they had heard his silence. They had made their assumptions. And still, when the world dangled a child over concrete, it was Darnell who moved, not for applause, not for praise, but because his instinct said a child was about to fall and no one else was stepping forward. Somewhere nearby, a siren wailed as the ambulance carried Luis and his mother home. The city resumed its rhythm. But on that lot, under that sky, one man had shown everyone what courage actually looked like. Not shiny, not loud, just steady hands and a decision made in a heartbeat, the kind that didn't need a cape, just a heart that wouldn't look away. Later that evening, the skies over New Orleans thickened again with storm clouds, heavy and low like they hadn't finished what they started the night before. Rain didn't fall yet, but the air carried the weight of it, moist, metallic, full of tension. Inside the small break room of the construction site, now dimly lit and quiet, Darnell sat alone, rinsing his hand beneath the rust-stained sink. The cut on his palm stung against the cold tap, but he didn't flinch. He'd known worse. This pain, at least, had meaning. Behind him, on the cork bulletin board, someone had tacked up a blurry printout of the rescue photo. Someone must have taken it with their phone just as he reached Luis. The image caught Darnell mid-stride on the scaffold, one hand out, the boy suspended. The others had joked quietly that he looked like something out of a movie, but to Darnell, it didn't look like heroism, it looked like instinct. It looked like something he couldn't not do. The next morning he showed up to work as usual. He didn't expect applause, he didn't get any either, which suited him fine. There were fewer side-eyes that day, fewer muttered jokes. People gave him space. A kind of quiet respect filled the air, tentative, uncertain, like no one knew what to say without sounding either fake or guilty. Some avoided eye contact altogether. But someone else came looking for him. Her heels echoed on the concrete as she crossed into the site, an unusual sound in a place made for boots and steel toes. Darnell looked up and immediately recognized her, though she looked different without the panic. Carla Mendez, Luis's mother, and more than that, Principal Mendez of the elementary school across the street. She was dressed in a gray blazer now, raincoat folded over one arm, her other hand clutching a manila envelope. Her face was calm, but her eyes still carried the remnants of yesterday's fear. Darnell stood and wiped his hands on his pants automatically, unsure if he was in trouble, unsure of anything. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "do you have a minute?" He nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." She looked around the site. Concrete dust, loose boards, the humming lull of drills in the distance. Then she turned back to him. "I watched the footage from the security camera," she said, voice even. "And I saw what no one else did." Darnell blinked, unsure what she meant. "I saw your eyes," she continued, "before you moved. You didn't flinch. You didn't look for someone else. You just acted. And I want you to know something." She paused, her tone softening. "That boy is everything to me. His father passed last year. He hasn't let another man near him without a meltdown since. But he won't stop talking about you." Darnell looked down, a bit embarrassed. "He's a brave kid." She nodded. "He is. But he had help yesterday. From someone who didn't owe him a thing." He said nothing. There was always a catch when people praised you too much. Either they wanted something or they were about to shift blame. But what she did next surprised him. She handed him the envelope. "Inside is an offer," she said. "We've got a safety program at the school, crosswalk supervision, facilities assessment, groundskeeping. It's part-time, pays steady, indoors mostly. You'd be working with people who'd treat you with more than indifference." Darnell blinked, caught off guard. "Ma'am, I'm just a laborer." She smiled gently. "No, you're a protector, and our kids need more of those than ever." He hesitated, thumb grazing the edge of the envelope. "I've got work here," he said. "Not as an excuse, just the truth." "You've got work anywhere," she replied, "but maybe it's time to be somewhere they see more than just your hands." He didn't answer. Not yet. But her words sat heavy in his chest, like they were reaching places long buried. That night, at home in his small rental apartment on the east side of town, Darnell sat at his kitchen table, staring at the envelope. The overhead bulb flickered, casting soft shadows on the stained linoleum. His daughter, Sierra, 12 years old and sharp as a nail, leaned over from across the table. "What's that?" she asked. "Job offer," he replied. She arched an eyebrow. "At the school?" "Yeah." "Cool," she said, pretending to go back to homework but sneaking glances. "Is it safer than climbing scaffolds?" He smirked. "Just a little." "Yeah. You gonna take it?" He didn't answer right away. He thought about the years he'd spent in silence, working jobs where he was just another strong back, just another black man in a hard hat no one remembered after the bell. He thought about how it felt when people assumed he'd done time because of how he walked, how he dressed, how he existed. And he thought about Luis, about the boy's hands shaking, about the way he clung like Darnell was an anchor in the middle of a storm. He looked at Sierra, who was watching him closer than she let on. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe it's time for something different." The next day he went to the school. Not to accept, not yet, but to walk the perimeter. The yard where kids played, the small tool shed that would become his if he took the job. He stood under the big oak tree out back and listened. Laughter, shouts, life, not survival, living. And for the first time in a long time he imagined what it might be like to go to work where people saw him not just as what he could carry, but as who he was. Carla met him near the front doors. She didn't press, just handed him a cup of coffee and said, "There's a place for you here if you want it." He didn't answer. But he didn't walk away either. And for a man who had been running alone for most of his life, that was as close as he'd ever come to standing still long enough to be seen. Behind the man who saved a child, there had been a boy once, dangling between silence and despair, hoping someone might see him before he slipped. No one had. Not then. But maybe now, in a schoolyard lined with voices and second chances, that boy had finally been pulled to safety, too. Weeks passed. The incident at the construction site faded from the news cycle, replaced by newer crises and louder headlines. But inside the halls of Charles Drew Elementary School, something had changed in a way that didn't fade. The fence that once barely separated the construction zone from the schoolyard was replaced with reinforced panels and fresh warning signs. The city issued new regulations on construction safety near active schools. A memo was sent out, some signatures collected, and then life moved on. For most. But not for the children. Not for Luis. and not for Darnell Brooks. Darnell took the job, not for the pay, which was modest, or the hours, which were shorter than he was used to, but for something harder to name. Something that stirred inside him when he walked through the school gate each morning and heard kids shouting his name with the kind of enthusiasm that no work site had ever held. Mr. D, Mr. Darnell, they called as they ran to him, hands waving, faces lit. He never got used to it. Didn't try to. Just smiled quietly and nodded, the way a man does when he's not sure how to hold joy in his hands. His uniform was simpler now. Blue slacks, soft work boots, a polo with the school crest. No heavy helmet, no rusted scaffolding. His tools were a walkie-talkie and a clipboard. But his real work wasn't on paper. It was in the way he watched the yard, how he studied the angles where kids might trip, where the ground dipped, where a ball might roll too far toward the street. He knew the cost of moments, how fast safety could vanish, how long it took to recover, and he never forgot. The school gave him a new title, Safety Liaison and Community Support. Fancy words maybe, but the kids called him Guardian, not officially, just whispered it with reverence when he wasn't listening. Louis started it, and it stuck. He's like a superhero, one girl said. Only real. At first, the parents weren't sure what to make of him. Some of them still carried the old instincts, the glances, the clutched purses, the forced smiles. But kids are better judges of character than adults ever are, and slowly, surely, their trust began to bleed into the grown-ups. They saw the way Darnell stood in the rain without an umbrella, just to make sure every child made it from the car to the door. They saw how he knelt to tie a shoe, lifted a kindergartner who scraped her knee, and fixed the loose latch on the gate before anyone had to ask. Principal Mendez made good on her promise too. She invited Darnell to staff meetings, not as a guest, but as a voice. Asked him what he thought, what he saw. She made space, and in that space he found a version of himself that had long been buried under layers of concrete and survival. He even spoke to a group of older students one day, nervous as hell, palms sweating through his shirt. He told them about choices, about how every moment was a brick in the life they were building. He didn't use big words. He didn't have a degree. But the room was silent the entire time. Even the troublemakers leaned in, and when he finished there was no applause. Just stillness, the kind that comes when truth lands exactly where it's needed. It wasn't all perfect. There were hard days, days when he missed the numb predictability of construction. Days when parents questioned his presence or the past he never tried to hide. But he didn't run. He stood in it, answered when asked, and let his actions do what words rarely could. One Friday afternoon, long after the final bell had rung and the buses had rolled away, Darnell stood alone near the edge of the playground, looking out at the sky. It had just finished raining, light this time, and the air smelled clean. The sunset painted streaks of gold across the asphalt. Luis walked up beside him, now more confident, taller, smile easier. He didn't say anything at first, just stood next to Darnell and looked out too. Then he said, "Do you miss the other job?" Darnell thought for a moment. "Sometimes," he admitted. "I liked building things." Luis nodded. "You still are." Darnell looked down at the boy, caught off guard. Luis shrugged. "You just build different stuff now, like safety, and trust, and people." Darnell smiled at that, slow and quiet, the kind of smile that starts from the heart and rises like heat from sun-baked concrete. He ruffled the boy's hair gently. "You're getting smart," he said. Luis grinned. "I learn from the best." The sun dipped a little lower, shadows stretching long across the yard. Darnell took one last look around, then walked toward the side door, keys jangling softly at his hip. The job wasn't flashy. There were no headlines now, no phone videos. But in a city still healing from wounds both old and fresh, in a school tucked between construction sites and cracked sidewalks, one man had become more than a worker. He had become a foundation. New Orleans had plenty of cracks, some in pavement, others in people. But every now and then someone like Darnell stepped in with no blueprint, no applause, just steady hands and a heart that refused to look away, and somehow, brick by brick, child by child, they patched something broken into something better. Not with grand speeches, not with armor or capes, just with presence, and the quiet kind of courage that saves lives long after the danger has passed. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.